Um, Welcome and good afternoon. I'm Mark Trescon, a principal research associate at the Urban Institute. My first line is that there is plenty of spaces up front if people do want to sit. So that's the one thing I think I want to start off with a little bit. I just want to thank everybody for being here today, joining in the room and online. And before I jump in, a few notes of housekeeping. So first of all, the event's being recorded. So the recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. And if you are joining us virtually, the live captions are turned on. You should adjust these at the bottom of your screen. If you're in the room, you have a QR code you can use to submit questions. Otherwise, the virtual audience can type in their questions on the Q&A box at any time. We'll also be sharing a link to the post-event survey, and we ask you to share our feedback with us. It's helpful for us and panelists to hear what you're thinking and the shape of what we actually do in the future. And again, if you'd like to continue the conversation online, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So again, thanks for joining today, and let's get going. To signpost our agenda, we're going to start with an overview presentation on housing affordability, zoning, and Urban's research on zoning policies supported by Habitat for Humanity's Cost of Home campaign. So this work was led by myself and Jorge Gonzalez, who will be up here in a little bit, and a team with Noah McDaniel, Dennis Su, Isabella Ramor, and Arzo Azizi. So the presentation will help frame the panel discussion and introduce the issue for those less familiar with it. This will be followed by our panel of land use reforms. So our panelists include Angela Brooks, the president of the American Planning Association, Leah Gaskins, councilwoman, Alexandria, Virginia, Dan Rosenzweig, the president and CEO, Habitat for Humanity of Greater Charlottesville, and our colleagues at Urban, Yona Freemark and Christina Stacy, who will be doing the moderation. So the panel Q&A will be followed after that for you in person with the reception. Okay, so setting the stage. A central reason we're here today is a backdrop of affordable housing crisis across the United States. Affordable housing has been hampered by two trends over the past number of decades. First of all, just increasing housing costs, and also stagnant wages. So this combination, that means in general, housing is less affordable than it used to be. Although very recent indicators show wages increasing and housing stabilizing a bit in some markets over the last year or so, housing affordability is still a profound problem. According to census data, 40 million households, 1/3 of the United States, spent more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and about 20 million households spent more than half of their income on housing costs, which is the definition of severely cost-burdened. Another way of framing this debate, which is shown by the chart at the right, is done by the National Low-Income Housing Coalition's out-of-reach reports. They compare the rent that could be affordable to a household to what rents actually are. So in their 2023 report, the rent affordable to a family of 4 with a poverty-level income was half of the average fair market rent. And again, this is just the average. The disconnect is considerably more pronounced in more expensive housing markets. And this matters because housing affordability is tied to housing stability. Housing instability destabilizes families and communities. There's a huge research on these issues and topics and the harmful effects of things like foreclosures and evictions of our communities to know that unaffordable housing leads to a host of problems. So what's going on? Now, there's a lot of interconnected reasons, but in the interest of not wanting to speak at you for 4.5 hours, and because of the growing recognition of it as a critical factor shaping our communities, we focus today on the role of zoning in particular. So zoning, what is it? Some of you might recognize this picture. At its most basic level, zoning separates uses. The image at right is of the SimCity computer game. This is the Mac Classic version, which I played, which in its original form, in particular, was really just a zoning simulation. So zoning can be understood as a process of organizing land use over space. What's allowed and what isn't in a different place, in a different location, whether at the basic level, residential, industrial, or commercial uses, and how those things relate to one another. That's very basic. Zoning in practice is a lot more complicated than those 3 basic options, though. Regulations affect building form, relation to the streetscape, and intensity of use, among other things. This can mean things like height limits, form requirements, parking requirements and minimums, and density limits more broadly. Now, zoning is a lot more complicated than this, of course. There's also things like overlays and special districts that we're not going to detail here, although maybe the panel later will get into it to an extent. But we want to focus on density in particular because I'm keeping this at a somewhat higher level. So zoning regulations have been around for quite a while, and some of the impetus was literally just tall buildings. Some of you also recognize this building on the right, which is the Cairo building in Washington, D.C., which was built in 1897 and within 2 years led to the first version of the Height Act, limiting building heights in the city, in the district. Also, an overly high commercial building in New York City was one of the factors leading to the city's 1916 zoning code there, basically which limited both how buildings could be built, which is why you have those pyramid-shaped buildings in New York, but also the residential fabric of especially Manhattan. So these sort of regulations were increasingly enacted in the 1920s, and the federal government actually played a role in supporting this. They drafted model bills for states to use to set up actually local zoning regimes. So basically by the 1920s, kind of the world that we're in, it's gotten more complicated over the last 100 years, but it was kind of set. So how does this tie back to affordability? First, and perhaps most obviously, regulating residential density affects how many units can fit and what sort of units exist. And it also channels where these buildings can actually be built. So in practice in the United States, this has meant that a large share of residentially zoned hard limits has been limited construction to single family, usually detached housing. This image is from a 2019 New York Times feature showing the city of Portland, Oregon. There, again, as of 2019, and we complicate that, and Jorge will be talking about this, 77% of residential land use in the city was zoned for detached single family homes. So in a place like Portland, with ongoing increased demand for housing, in a city that, especially at that point, was already pretty much built out, it meant supply could really only be increased in some locations or further out in the region. This is another thing I'm only going to touch on for the moment, but I want to stress that this isn't just a city issue or a central city issue. It's a regional issue because with low density zoning kind of codified, it has exacerbated economic exclusion and racial segregation across the country and across the regional level. So suburbs, cities, and other municipalities across the country. And this has had a profound impact on transportation systems and the environment, just to pick a couple examples. So it's in this context that has resulted in an effort over the last number of years to really rethink the value of density and build more inclusive communities with a greater diversity of building types, and led to a lot more interest in zoning in particular. So this argument at this most basic level is couched in terms of supply and demand. If demand increases, but supply does not, costs go up. And this has made zoning increasingly political. Perhaps the most recent popular version, or one of the more popular framings, is something called the Yes in My Backyard movement, which got going in the San Francisco Bay Area, in particular due to very high housing costs, and as well as a response to more traditional Not in My Backyard, or NIMBY movement, or efforts that limit development and protect existing communities, and particularly NIMBYism protects the built form of communities. So the NIMBY movement is explicitly pushing for more housing and for policies that allow that to happen. I should also note, and this puts this in greater context, zoning is just one potential tool for promoting affordable housing. The effects of existing zoning systems have often become clear only over decades, and similarly, effects of zoning reforms are probably going to become more clear over time. So that's something I think to keep in mind in our discussion today, and we actually read of things like zoning. It's also important to consider the relationships between zoning reforms and other housing affordability tools. So this actually leads us back to our discussion of our work with Habitat for Humanity and its Cost of Home campaign. The Cost of Home campaign is a 5-year advocacy campaign launched in 2019, centered around influencing policy creation and implementation with the goal of supporting access to affordable homes for 10 million people. It was designed to promote the introduction and passage of affordable housing policies and assist local habitat organizations do their local work. To date, local habitat organizations have reported 350 policy wins since the campaign started. And Habitat has organized these into 4 major policy areas: increasing the supply and preservation of affordable homes, equitably increasing access to credit, ensuring access to and development of communities of opportunity, and the one that's most focused on land use and zoning, optimizing land use for affordable homes. So in our work for Habitat, we involved a few activities. Our initial project was an examination and assessment of 8 local and state housing policies that Habitat affiliates had supported over their advocacy efforts. So as a part of this, we explored theories of change, available evidence of impact, estimated outcomes based on publicly available data, and 2 of these, which Jorge will discuss shortly, were focused on zoning. This is the Housing Choice Bill in Oregon, Housing Choices Bill in Oregon, and the Affordability Unlock program in Austin, Texas. We also, as another part of the work, create a policy typology of the cost of home policies to provide an overview of the campaign's intended impact and what sort of policy advocacy looked like across the United States. For zoning, we actually identified a range of types that basically fit into the various categories of what kind of zoning efforts there were. So these range from legislation, making changes to regulation, to plans and resolutions to things like zoning reform, to policies allowing more housing units to be built, and again, to policies to reduce housing development costs. This highlighted for us, and hopefully for Habitat, how local and state level policy matches the needs and context of different places. I think, for example, at California and the West Coast, like California, Washington, Oregon in particular, there's been a lot of activity at zoning, but also at the state level in particular. And a lot of it has been focused on structural change, like basically changing zoning regime in particular. And that has looked different in other parts of the country with less state level support or focus, but also just different things in different places. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Jorge to present evidence from our zoning related work specifically.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this exciting conversation on such an important and also fascinating topic. As Mark mentioned, I want to share with you some of the findings from our study of 2 of the policies that were supported by the Cost of Home campaign in Oregon and in Austin. Now, both of these policies passed in 2019. Actually, the Housing Choices Bill in Oregon was not implemented until 2021 and 2022. And as Mark mentioned, this kind of interventions really take a long time, even decades sometimes, to show their full impact. But we decided to study them regardless because we believe it's important to track and document early outcomes, even if definitive conclusions about their effectiveness are still a work in progress. And we decided this for different reasons. One is there is momentum right now across the country with so many stakeholders looking into reforming zoning codes in their communities and looking for examples and case studies. But also because these reforms are also not without controversy or opposition, so gathering the facts that can inform these debates and really root them in evidence is essential. So with that said, let me start with Oregon's Housing Choices Bill. In a nutshell, the Housing Choices Bill required municipalities to legalize other forms of housing where it allowed only exclusively single-family housing. Small cities, those with populations between 10 and 25,000 people, had to legalize duplexes, while larger cities, more than 25,000 people, had to legalize up to fourplexes and other kinds of building types. And the bill, while mandating localities to update their zoning codes to legalize certain types of housing, it still provided for substantial flexibility in implementation to the localities. So the municipalities were able to still establish their own regulations around design or procedural requirements and other aspects. And not only that, but Oregon's Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is the state agency in charge of implementing the bill, also supported the localities in implementing the bill and comply with it by providing technical assistance, by creating a model code that they could use as a sample. And we really credit both this support from the state to the localities and also the flexibility that it allowed them as a reason why it had a relatively smooth sailing in terms of implementation, because the state had little to no pushback from the municipalities. And this is no small feat if we compare it to other examples, like, for example, in California, where the state has attempted to do this with some pushback from the cities. And so by the end of 2022, all of the 56 municipalities affected by the bill had approved or implemented a compliant code. So what did we find in our study? We looked at building permits for different housing types for different cities of different sizes. The first chart that you see right now shows housing permits in small cities. So again, these are the ones that had to legalize duplexes only. I want to direct your attention to the yellow and blue lines right now. And you can notice that for a few years, the share of permits for single-family housing was somewhat the same as for other denser types of housing, in this case, threeplexes and above. But in 2022, really, single-family housing became more prominently the majority type of newly issued permits in these cities. And we saw denser housing going down as a share of all of the housing permits for that year. And so interesting that in this context, with the market moving towards more single-family housing, that we saw duplexes, here represented by the pink line, grow as a share of all of the housing types. So they went in 2021 from representing only 2% of all of the housing permits to representing 6% in 2022. Now, this, of course, in absolute terms is a very modest increase, but in relative terms, it's quite a significant one. In large cities, we actually did not see any changes in the permits for newly legalized housing types. So in this case, duplexes to fourplexes, which are represented in the pink line. However, in this case, there is an important caveat, and it is that most of the permits in this group of cities are permits that were issued in the city of Portland. And what Portland did when complying with Housing Choices Bill is that it went above what the law required. It actually legalized up to sixplexes. So now the fiveplexes and sixplexes would actually be reflected in the yellow line, which did see a modest increase in 2022 and really since 2020. And those would be affected by the implementation of the bill. Unfortunately, the state housing data, permit data that we use for this does not allow us to disaggregate these housing types from all of the others. But we didn't stop there, and we try to look for other ways and other data sources to test whether the bill may have had an impact in Portland specifically. So we looked at other housing permit data from the Federal Reserve in this case. And we found that from 2018 up to the point in which Portland updated its zoning code, which was around mid-2021, single-family permits made up the majority of all of the housing permits. But from the date in which the new zoning code became active up to mid-2023, that relationship flipped, and we saw housing types different from single-family becoming the majority. Now, we can't conclusively say that the Housing Choices Bill impacted housing production in medium or large cities, at least, since we can't disaggregate the permit data to look exclusively at the housing types that were legalized by the bill. But these results do tell us that at least directionally, it seems the market is moving towards more denser housing. Now let's travel to Austin, Texas, where we studied the city's Affordability Unlocked program, which operated as a density bonus program. And by density bonus, it really means that the program offers a set of waivers and bonuses to developers on a project-by-project basis, conditional on providing different levels of affordability in these projects. So if you have a project that has at least half of the units affordable, then you can increase your building height by 25%, and you can also increase the maximum number of units that you can build in a single lot to 6 if the lot was restricted to something lower than that. If projects with at least 75% of all units are affordable, they can increase the maximum building height by 50%, and you can build up to 8 units in a single lot, again, if restricted to something lower than that. And on top of these bonuses, developers also can waive cumbersome and costly requirements, such as compatibility standards, which are the regulations that tell you how far the building has to be from the front, the side, or the rear of your lot. These are the kind of regulations that are in place to try to minimize how much sunlight is going to be blocked by a new development. Also, the program reduced minimum parking requirements. However, since then, the city of Austin has actually gotten rid of minimum parking requirements. I believe it is the largest city in the US that has achieved this. Now, just a note here is that while the bonuses and the waivers that are offered by the program are substantial, there is a high affordability requirement, and this means that this tool is really targeted at mission-driven developers that were already planning on producing affordable housing and using some other type of program or subsidies for it. It's not necessarily a tool that is targeted at market rate developers or a tool that is going to turn some market rate projects into affordable housing projects. And now the image that you see right now, this is a project called the Zilker Studios. It has 110 units of permanent supportive housing. It used Affordability Unlocked, and thanks to the program, it actually was able to add 2 stories to the building and also 45 units, again, of permanent affordable housing. And this is thanks to Affordability Unlocked. So looking at housing production that is leveraging this program, we found that since 2019, when the program was approved and implemented, the city has approved close to 8,000 new housing units using the program. Around 900 of those are completed. These are apartment buildings that are in service right now. They are in the market, and around 3,500 units are right now under construction. These are units that leverage Affordability Unlocked. And we found that when compared to other housing projects that are utilizing some form of affordable housing program or incentive or subsidy, Affordability Unlocked projects were larger in terms of the number of units in a given project, and they were also more affordable in terms of the share of the units that are affordable. In the picture here, you're seeing a project called V Colina, 170 unit project that used the program. All of the units are affordable. And you may be wondering, okay, but what do you mean by affordable units and affordability? So of course, it can mean different things, but measured by the area median income, we found that Affordability Unlocked projects were deeply affordable at different levels and even compared to other affordable housing projects. So almost 70% of the units are affordable for a family making 80% of the Austin median income. And I was doing the math a little earlier, that is about $70,000 a year. And more than 30% of the units are affordable for a family making 50% of the Austin median income. That would be around $46,000 a year. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a program targeted at developers that are already focused or already planning on providing affordable housing. But what we can confirm after studying this is that the program, one, it is meeting its requirements in terms of affordability. The levels of affordability that it said it would achieve, it is achieving those for the programs that are leveraging these incentives, for the project, sorry. And also, it is actually a program, it's an important tool that is allowing affordable housing developers to scale up their projects and in that way also scale up their impact. Now, I'm just going to conclude by reiterating how important it is to track this kind of innovative and in many ways trailblazing initiatives early on, even if we cannot fully attest the effectiveness and reach conclusions. Because places across the US are exploring or attempting to reform their zoning codes to make more room for housing for everyone. And so in this context, we need as much knowledge and gather as many facts as we can about these initiatives to know how best to leverage zoning tools to improve access to housing for all. And luckily, we have a fascinating panel that collectively has as much knowledge as we can imagine on this topic. So with that, I want to welcome my colleague, Tina Stacy, who will be moderating our panel. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Is this on? Yes. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to be sitting here with this amazing panel of experts from across the country, really, to talk about this topic today. So right next to me, we have Angela Brooks, who's the president of the American Planning Association, Yona Freemark, who's my colleague here at the Urban Institute, Aaliyah Gaskins, who is the councilwoman of my home city, Alexandria. Thank you for serving our city. And Dan Rosenwig, the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Greater Charlottesville. My name's Tina Stacy. I'm a principal research associate here at the Urban Institute and just really delighted to see so much interest in this topic. I was told that it's the most highly RSVP'd event since pre-COVID. So it's really great to see that people are really interested in this and are pushing for this across the nation. So to start, Angela, in your view, can you tell us what you see as the core relationship between land use and housing affordability.
Yes, well, first, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here. And likewise, you know, this might be the first time in my whole life my father somewhat understands what I do for a living, because zoning is like on the news. And he's like, hey, I think my daughter does that. So with that said, as both the president of the APA, but also an affordable housing developer, you know, this topic hits home to me on a day-to-day basis in trying to provide housing for all, which many of you in this audience do. And I think the direct correlation, your colleagues did a good job of setting the stage and really looking at supply and demand. We all know basic economics. The less supply, the more expensive and demand it is. And, you know, as we look at things that are barriers to creating more housing, it traditionally has been zoning. And the history of zoning in itself, if we're honest, is really, it was a tool of racist segregation. And so as we start looking at creating more equitable spaces and places for everybody to live, it's probably the first thing we have to do to really look at providing more spaces. It's really exciting to see some of the examples that Jorge went through in some of the cities that have been really aggressive moving forward on really zoning reform. It's, I don't know, our staff person from APA is here. It's our APA's top priority issue this year is zoning reform, and how we can partner with all of you in the cities that you're in making sure that you have places for the residents that you serve to live, and not only live, but to thrive. And so providing housing options from the most expensive houses to the space I work in, which is permanent supportive housing. Those are our unhoused residents in our cities have somewhere to go. And that means housing can't just be the models that I grew up in, which is a single family house, which is, you know, a privilege certainly I acknowledge that I had. But we have to start looking at denser options, and they can all work together. And so looking at what that looks like is part of the work that I'm excited that we're starting to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Dan, do you have anything to add to that based on the work you do on the ground, your relationship between zoning and affordability that you see?
Yeah, I should preface it by saying that as Jorge mentioned, the stats aren't yet in because Charlottesville just passed a comprehensive zoning reform 2 months ago, and it actually is enacted this week. So we're pretty excited about that. But we speculate on what the results will be. And just like Portland, we were looking at a land use map and a consequential and a subsequent zoning code that was 70% R1, or the least intensive, least dense use you can do on a parcel in Charlottesville. And that all seemed to be, you know, for the 50 plus years of the existence of our zoning code, a fairly innocuous thing until you start to peel back the onion a little bit. And so we did, and we went to the courthouse in Charlottesville, and we started just pulling deeds, and realized that almost every one of the 70% of those parcels were originally deed restricted as anti-Black and or anti-Jewish. And then we started looking at some other key historical documents, like a map by a racist planner named Harlan Bartholomew, who came to Charlottesville, as he did to a lot of other small southern towns, and walked around neighborhoods and said, you know, this is a good one, you should keep this and preserve it and protect it via zoning, and this is a rough one, it's ramshackle, you should tear it down. And he drew a map that where he circled the neighborhoods that needed to come down, and they were certainly in need of reinvestment, and those were all the Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville. And all the neighborhoods that were to be protected were the 70% of the land in Charlottesville that had been deed restricted whites only. Now there was more as you start to peel the onion skin back a little bit more. One of the reasons why some of the neighborhoods that were Black only or primarily Black run or invested in is because the city didn't extend sewer and water. They were islands of rural infrastructure in the middle of the city. And so it's clear there's not a direct correlation because the laws redlining deed restrictions were invalidated decades ago. But the legacy has lived on, and Charlottesville has remained an incredibly segregated city despite its thinking, the way it thinks about itself as very progressive and equity-based.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that across the nation, right? A long history of racist policymaking and planning in the housing realm that not only led to segregated communities, but this lack of intergenerational wealth building amongst Black families in particular. And we will come back to that topic in a minute. But before we do, Yona, what examples come to mind when thinking of land use reforms that have shown a positive impact on housing affordability?
I think this is actually a difficult question to answer because of the fact that so many of these zoning reforms are so new, especially in the United States. We see examples like Portland, which offer some promising results so far, but it's too early to be able to actually say this reform had this outcome. I think it's worth then stepping back a second and asking, what do current zoning laws actually prevent, and we know they prevent? We did a study of the Seattle region, and we looked at where all the subsidized affordable housing units were all across the Seattle region. And what we found was that 9% of them are located on the 3% of land that multifamily units are allowed. And so what that means is that we know for a fact that our zoning laws are restricting certain types of housing to certain types of areas. And that often results in the segregative, income-based, class and racial segregation that really destroys the sense of collective society that we'd like to see, I think, I would like to see in the United States. That said, there is some interesting evidence that zoning reforms do have some powerful effects. And there are some examples that I think are really worth pointing to. So one of them is the reforms that have led to allowing accessory dwelling units in California, Portland, and Seattle. Those have been incredibly successful in generating thousands of units. I believe in California there have been 10,000 units or more that have been authorized throughout that state. But if you look internationally, you see some even more potentially promising results of larger scale zoning reforms. So I think in the US we've mostly done some rather small scale zoning changes, but outside of the US, in places like Auckland, New Zealand, Zurich, Switzerland, you see much larger changes, Sao Paulo, Brazil, I should add, where we have true research evidence that show that those changes have not only resulted in a large increase in housing production, which means more units on the ground, but also a reduction in overall regional rent and household cost levels. So I think those are really positive examples that we could look to in the United States.
Yeah, that's great. And that sets up perfectly for Councilwoman Gaskins. I know Alexandria passed an ADU allowance a few years ago. I should know. I was part of that team helping with that. I should know the date. But and I know Alexandria just passed zoning for housing reforms. Could you talk a little bit about that and how you hope it will address racial equity in the city?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you today. So last fall, with a unanimous vote from the City Council, we passed our set of zoning reforms. The official title was Zoning for Housing, Housing for All, and it was a set of 8 what we believe are comprehensive policy reforms focused on increasing accessibility, availability, and affordability. So it ranges from things related to how we address office to residential conversions to how we look at creating additional options in our single family zones. I think as we talk about kind of how we hope it's going to address racial equity, I think this is why the title is so long but so important. And it's really the housing for all piece. When we set out with this effort, we said, we needed intentional and an explicit focus on equity as part of this conversation. We know that our city didn't just appear the way it is today, that past policies, like some of those that have been named, as well as others like redlining and urban renewal, they have shaped the contours and the ways in which our city has grown over time. And that we felt we couldn't just enter into a zoning conversation about density and height and so forth without setting that stage. And so Housing for All is really where you can go to our website and you can begin to look at not just what is redlining, but how did that show up in community? What are racial covenants and where are the neighborhoods where they existed? What are the properties where they look at? So there's a lot of maps. There's also oral histories and stories, so you can also get a real sense of what did this mean for how people have lived, moved, and not been able to move in our community. And in each of the sessions that we did, sort of as we talked about different zoning reforms, we really started with, let's go back to that history. Let's start with that story. Let's start with that data. Let's start with those maps before we enter into proposals about reforms. It also led us to have an explicit kind of equity statement for each and every one of our reforms. And now we're going to be using that to hopefully create what we're calling maybe a dashboard to be able to measure and track so that we can be intentional in our work.
That's great. Angela, do any other examples pop to mind of reforms that you think have been shown success or are inspiring?
I think inspiring. I think you're right. It is a little early for a lot of these. I mean, we know Up for Growth released the report early, well, I guess last year now, later last year, that really shows we're underproduced in this country by almost 4 million units. So we know that we are not producing enough housing at all tiers. So if we're not producing them at market rate, they're not coming down to the tiers that many of us work in. So things that we're seeing, we talked a little bit about ADUs, Montana, and I like to use Montana because most of us can't think of a big city in Montana, so it tends to relate to a wider group of, if I talk about my hometown of Seattle or Chicago where I live. Montana did the Montana Miracle last year, or 2 years ago, and there's a bunch of land use reforms that essentially allows throughout the state ADUs, duplexes, and triplexes in all zones. And that's a state that has smaller, more rural type stuff, and it's working there. And I had the opportunity to meet with their governor earlier last year, and one of the things he said was it was bipartisan, and so it's showing us that this isn't a partisan issue. And for me, in my years of working, it's the first time I've been able to see bipartisan support on an issue such as housing, and it's mostly because we're all bleeding to provide more units. And so that's something that makes me very cautiously optimistic that we will start really moving the needle. The favorite topic, and I know some of you are experts on this, is parking. It's, I get creamed for this a lot when I'm talking about it, but looking at parking maximums and starting to really reduce parking minimums and changing the way, but it also means we have to change the way a lot of us think. And it's, I spent a lot of time in Europe last year, and, it's very easy to see people sharing spaces, but that's still something we're fighting for here, and looking at multimodal transportation and all of those types of things. So seeing cities really talking about that, and not just large cities. Sandpoint, Idaho, which is another smaller city, they removed all parking requirements throughout their downtown, which is huge. So looking at cities, really looking at how do we move the needle, because I don't know how many of you have paid for, in your developments, parking, but parking is really expensive. So you start thinking about things that contribute to the cost of a unit. In Chicago right now, our affordable units are coming in at $600,000 per, and that's on the low end. Who's that affordable to? So when you're looking at, and particularly planners, when we're coming up with our lofty ideas of things that we want, well, if you're adding $50,000 per unit cost, then we're part of the problem. So those are the things that are exciting me as a planner and developer that I'm seeing cities start to really look at.
Yeah, we're seeing that movement. Now, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about, some potential concerns for even when there are equity goals and development goals and affordability goals, could be potentially cases in which upzoning and reforms lead to inequities. So this is really a question for all, but you and I can start with you. So, for instance, do you think that the evidence shows that zoning reforms can encourage gentrification in certain neighborhoods?
This is a difficult question, especially for me, because I've done research on Chicago, finding that when a zoning change was passed there was an uptick in property values. And there was a similar study done of Minneapolis after the passage of their reform allowing multifamily units on single-family lots, showing that those lots became more valuable. And this, I think, raised a lot of concern among folks out there, including me, that perhaps this increase in property values resulting from upzoning might mean displacement or gentrification in the long term. The good news, I think, is that, number one, most of the increase in that value appears to be occurring on vacant or underutilized land, which indicates that actually when you see those value increases, it means that people want to invest in new properties to add more housing units to the area. So we shouldn't be necessarily too concerned about people's rent going up. And that's especially true when you think about the study that you led, Tina, if I can point to you. So Tina led a study looking at reforms that were passed all over the United States and found that actually on average there was a reduction in rent. I think there's some more research to be done on that front, but I don't think we have enough evidence right now to be super concerned about displacement and gentrification from upzoning.
Interesting. Yes?
Happy to chime in. So for us, this is a huge personal concern of mine, but it was also something that as we were doing our roundtables and community conversations came up over and over. And I think one of the things that we began to focus on is when we approached our zoning reforms, we were very explicit that this is just one part. This is the supply production part of the conversation. But that if we're truly going to have a functioning housing system, we also have to be focused on protection. We also have to be focused on preservation. And so it's a lot for cities to do at once, but I feel like we were also intentional in, okay, while we're working on our zoning reforms, we're a Dillon rule state, so we have to ask the state for permission to do pretty much anything. How do we at the same time be advocating to our state legislators that we need things around eviction prevention? We need things around right of first refusal. We need protections for rent increases. How do we deal with that at the same time? Then on the other side, how are we looking locally? Do we have rental assistance programs? Do we have we started the groundwork to look at maybe local voucher programs or community preference policies? And it was sometimes a hard conversation for our community because we're like, okay, yes, that's not zoning, but those are the things that maybe need to be in place as a complement in order to ensure that our zoning reforms work, but that also we are serving many parts of our community who are dealing with many significant other housing challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a key question. I'm glad you raised it because interestingly enough, there were sort of two camps that were concerned about upzoning in Charlottesville. It was folks from upper end communities and folks from low income communities were equally concerned for slightly different reasons. It stands to reason if you upzone equally across the city, the land that's cheapest to start with is probably going to see a greater rate of change. And people who'd lived in historically African American communities in our city had seen that change, and it hadn't necessarily been good. They hadn't basically benefited from the fruits of it, and they've seen their taxes rise. And so we heard, and we did a lot of talking to people, and we heard, we don't mind change, and we don't mind increasing density. We just don't want to all of a sudden become minorities in our own neighborhoods. And so I don't think there's a magic bullet for this, but this is what we're trying. We did what Jonah said sort of naturally occurs, this idea that density and affordability are all segregated and congregated in certain areas of the city, or affordability is because of zoning, and we have flipped it on its head. And so the most restrictive neighborhoods, we created a zoning classification called RNA. So the most restrictive neighborhoods are the ones that are the historically low-income communities and African-American communities in Charlottesville. It doesn't mean you can't invest in them, but there's an affordable housing overlay and a first unit protection overlay that says you can't go above 1 unit, or you can go above 1 unit if and only if that second unit's affordable and you preserve the existing structure. And then you can go up to 6 units. Whereas in RA, which is the formerly R1 neighborhoods, with affordability, you can get 6 units on a lot. And so we've tried to sort of flip historically what has been a source of inequity, and we'll see. The other piece of that is that I completely agree with Aaliyah, is that it can't be just zoning. You have to have a suite of other policies in place. And one of the things that we're looking at in Charlottesville is a hyper-synthetic TIF, a tax increment finance, whereby any additional tax revenue that comes in from reinvestment in low-income neighborhoods stays in that neighborhood, and the use of that, well, actually half of it does, so half of the increment, and the use of that is not provided to city council or across the city, but the neighborhood association or a body that's hyper-local gets to decide whether they want to invest that in affordable housing, parks, streetscapes, et cetera.
Yeah, super interesting. And that's a great example of, listening to historically excluded community members and making sure that, our housing and zoning and all of the planning that we do is not being only represented by homeowners who traditionally, aren't going to be disproportionately white because of our history. But so making it local and listening to community sounds so important. Is so important there. And there's also this component of time, right? There, you know, some of these reforms are going to take a while to bring supply and demand into effect. And so having policies that can address the short-term needs while also addressing, you know, short-term band-aids, but also addressing the underlying wound, I think is another good way to think about it. Angela, are there other policies or companion practices that you think should be implemented?
Yeah, you know, I think you kind of reminded me. So I also sit on the Chicago Zoning Board of Appeals, and I think about like our notice requirements, as you were talking about, they go to homeowners, they don't go to renters. And so a lot of our existing structures on how we have people participate in the process, we have to start relooking at how we do that as well. I think Councilmember Gaskins kind of went through it really well when we talk about some of the challenges that we have to address. But as someone who lives in an underinvested community, my community is affordable because there's not crap there. And so we can't continue to perpetuate underinvested communities for affordability. We as policymakers and developers have to be willing to jump and take the risk on making equitable communities throughout cities and think of these other things to protect those neighborhoods for people. Because I don't want my grandmother to be able to afford somewhere because they have crappy sewage or there's not a park or they get shocking to the bus, right? Or there's no lighting. So we really have to look at what are those other things and what is in the toolkit. And so I'm glad to hear as an elected leader, maybe because you have a planning degree, that you think about that. And so an example of of a city that I think has done a really good job, and we just gave them an APA National Award, is the city of Charlotte that's doing some pretty good work on zoning reform that was specifically tied to their comprehensive plan, which is a really big part of that, looking at the full plan of the city, not just zoning, but everything else. And I think I use them as an example because I think that's an important tie-in, particularly for the work we do as planners. So
Yeah, absolutely. All great points, and really important to do the yes and, right? Yes, we need to do this, and what else can we do? Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty a bit of how we get this done for people who are interested in passing reforms. How can housing advocates, policymakers, community members, and others collaborate to advocate for and implement effective land use reforms in their respective regions? Councilwoman Gaskins, I'm going to start with you since you just successfully did this.
Yeah. It's not easy. I think I believe in being honest. You know, I think when I look at some of the debates and the conversations we've had in Alexandria, this is probably one of the conversations that got the most divisive, got hateful at times, pulled maybe folks who would have never been allies before into relationships that you would not have expected. So I think that it's really important to be sensitive to this, that it's not as easy as here's the YIMBYs and here are the NIMBYs, that housing is so personal. People have so many perceptions about what it means, what's affordable, who needs affordable housing, and what that looks like. I think what we did that was particularly helpful in kind of easing into that conversation, and actually I think a lot of people who were initially very concerned to kind of help them with this, was one, going back to starting with that history. So starting with stories, starting with people who have lived and been in our community, who are new to our community, really from seniors to young people. We even had high school students involved, in trying to elevate and share kind of what are the housing challenges we're experiencing. What is your neighbor going through? Because I think that kind of helps make it more personal. I think the second is spending a lot of time on kind of shared language. As I mentioned, you know, people have really strong opinions about what is affordable housing, who should be able to afford it, where should it go, what does it look like? And so we had to spend a lot of time kind of defining, like, what does this mean? What is AMI? What are these different levels? What does that look like in our community? What does a police officer make? What does a teacher make? And things like that. And I think that was a lot of helpful grounding as well. And then the third, I think, is really being open to trying different forms of communicating. We had to learn that, you know, coming to a long presentation on like zoning 101 and here's every single reform, that doesn't work for most people. We had meetings in parking lots. We had, I went to one, it was a community cookout, because the community we were trying to reach there, they were like, we bond over food. And so it was a cookout, and there were maps and pictures. We had translators, but I think it was, we had other things where we're meeting with faith leaders. And at first they were like, why would I be a part of this conversation? But the more we talked to them about the fact most of your congregation doesn't live here anymore, and there's a reason why. So how do we begin to have this conversation in some of our faith institutions? So I would encourage you to also be creative. There's no one size fits all, and it's going to look different in each of your communities. But I think sometimes taking a step back to realize it doesn't always have to be presented in the same way, and that sometimes you have to slow down to get everybody on the same page about what we're talking about first, so that then you're able to move and think about some of the creative options that are being talked about up here.
Yeah. Dan, do you have?
Yeah, I would echo most of, if not all of that, is when you think about what are the ingredients, well, patience is one, because it takes a while. Along with patience, it's listening, so you need to go into every neighborhood and find out what people care about. Education is important as well, because zoning is complicated and it's technical, but it impacts everybody. And it has had a disproportionate impact, negative impact on people of color, and many people who just kind of have their heads down trying to get through the day. And so really finding that time and that space to listen and talk and interact and educate. And you have to persevere, and you have to build coalitions. And so, in Charlottesville, like many places, probably it's true in, I would dare say, just about everywhere that you come from the country, zoning is a sort of third rail, or starts out as a third rail sacred cow. And it's kind of, because it's been in existence, Euclidean zoning has been in existence for more than a century. It has just always been considered the way things always have been and the way they're supposed to be. Like, of course, you separate this use from that use. You separate, of course, we want these kinds of houses over here and this kind of housing over here. But the history of zoning is very much intentional. Not all zoning. Much of zoning was intended to pull people away from noxious uses. But what happened over the course of the last century was not only terrible for social democracy and for advancement and equity, but it was terrible for our planet. It was terrible for people. We've built cities and towns and sprawling suburbs for cars, not for people. And so there is a giant coalition of people that care about the intersections of a couple of those things. And so in Charlottesville, really the way it broke down, this is completely unscientific, I'm totally making this up here, but there was about 30% of the people were sort of young urbanists, frustrated by not being able to buy a house or live affordably in Charlottesville, wanted to be able to walk to stuff, wanted a place that was a little bit more hip and cool. 30% of the people were NIMBYs. This is the way it's always been. Zoning is what's wrong with what we have now. Our neighborhoods are beautiful, they're green, they're lush, et cetera. And then you had that soft middle of 40% or so who were persuadable. And so a lot of what we did for years and years and years was try to build a coalition of people in the environmental movement. And it's not, you'd be surprised about where people who consider themselves environmentalists stand on zoning issues. But to truly get people to understand the nexus between density and rural preservation and greenhouse gas emissions. The low-income housing community was central. And so it started out forming a coalition of like 3 people who used to show up at meetings at the local legal aid. And that grew to 7 and 10 and 15 and 30 and 300. And a lot of that was helping people understand and advocate. And so that 40% eventually became probably about 65%. If you judge it just by the pure numbers, when 1,000 people spoke at planning commission and city council meetings, about 65 or 70%, 700 people were speaking in favor of this really pretty dramatic and radical rezoning. Multifamily is allowed on every parcel in the city of Charlottesville now. There are no parking requirements citywide. There's a citywide overlay, so on every single parcel, if you do affordable housing, you can get more. And it's pretty dramatic. But it couldn't have happened just with us pointy heads pushing for it, those of us professionals in the space. It really requires a coalition.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a good topic that we didn't get to talk about yet. And Yona, I know this is your amazing area of expertise. So this connection between transportation and land use and zoning reform, could you talk a little bit about, and if we missed any other companion policies, but how do you think transportation fits within this, and then that connection to climate and the environment?
Well, thank you for bringing it up, Tina. I do appreciate it. You know, we've talked this entire time about housing affordability, typically defined as, you know, you're not supposed to pay more than 30% of your income for housing. Sounds great, okay, we can go with that. But the reality is that in terms of people's overall household costs, transportation accounts for a large share of that. On average, about 15 to 16% for the average household in the United States, but it can range dramatically. And what we know from the data is that people who don't have to drive, people who don't have cars, spend dramatically less than people with cars and who do have to drive. And fundamentally, what we've done with our zoning system for the last 100 years is create a system where every year more and more people have to drive because our regions spread further and further apart because of the single-family zoning that we enforce everywhere. This has terrible environmental consequences. It means destruction of ecological environments. It means more carbon pollution in the air. But fundamentally, it means people spending more money out of their paychecks on transportation. And so what I think anybody who's interested in housing needs to be thinking about, as well as housing costs, is the cost of the transportation people will need to get to that housing. And to make sure that where there are transportation options, public transportation options, there are adequate housing availability in the areas around those stations. So I really just hope that folks out there are thinking about them both at the same time.
Absolutely. And it's great to see kind of this increasing connection between climate activists and climate work and housing and transportation, and seeing this all come together.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes,
On that point?
absolutely.
One of the things I found really interesting is, you know, I've always been taught that connection. I think for most folks in the room, you probably know that intersection. And I noticed that we kind of had even a divide within our climate advocates, that there were those who were very clear that when we think about housing density and we think about availability and connectivity across our neighborhoods, that this is good not just for affordability, but it's also good for our climate goals. There were others who would then write the council and say, you know, if there are any reductions to open space or any trees damaged in this process, that we are then destroying the environment through our housing reforms. And so it was interesting because even with, I think, coalitions that you think would be natural allies, there were a lot of sort of division or differing ideas within there. And so we spent a lot of time also trying to provide the education around, we have an environmental action plan. We've set these goals that we want to achieve by 2040. Here's what it says on tree canopy. Here's what it says on carbon emissions. Here's what it says that we are trying to get to. And this is why this type of policy will help us get there. It doesn't mean that we automatically don't care about trees or that we don't care about other things that are key values to the Alexandria we want to have. The question becomes then, how do you integrate that into what we're doing? But I said it because it was interesting to me that I think there are certain groups that you're going to think, oh, well, they must be natural allies. And I think this conversation doesn't always yield that.
That is such a great point. Did you have anything to add to that?
I was going to just add, one of the things I see as a sitting zoning board person is I have started seeing people really organized to come. My day job is I work in permanent supportive housing, and so we had a transitional shelter in Chicago on the north side recently, and they had 300 people there. 298 of them were there to support it. And I have, in my whole career, never seen that. And the alderman was a supporter, so that also helps as well. But they organized to come, and the correlation to them was mostly, if we provide a shelter, there probably won't be an encampment. So there was a direct correlation. So, you know, but it showed a lot of effort of the advocates. And I will say storytelling is probably one of the best things, particularly for elected or appointed leaders, to tell the stories. You all, particularly those of you at Habitat, you have successful stories about the people you're housing. They probably look different than what the people, the NIMBYs, are saying and they're projecting, and they're the people with the mic. So bringing the residents that are benefiting from the policy is really, really important. And one of the things we're doing at APA for sure is the voice of, it takes a planner, and really advocating our planners to tell the positive stories, because the negative stories get the mic way more often. The people who have the most to say, or probably maybe even the time and the money, are sitting on X. They're putting it out there, but we're not very good storytellers about our wins, and we need to do a better job. So I really encourage all of you, particularly those of you going the Hill, tell those stories, show those pictures, and really hey, I'm talking to you, Senator blah, blah, in your neighborhood, we did this, and this person is now housed, and they're, and show those stories. It really does make a difference. And most important in your cities, as we're talking about zoning reforms and things as developers, will help you bring more units to the market. Show up at the meetings, because I promise you, the NIMBYs show up, and we hear them, and then, you've got maybe one or two elected leaders or commissioners that actually understand, and we look crazy because we're fighting against the NIMBYs. We need you there. So your presence is a huge piece of really making some changes, so.
Absolutely, engage, engage, engage. And that's a great segue into my next question, which is kind of a selfish one for Yona and I and other researchers in the audience is, what can research provide that can help with this movement? And I say that it's a good connection because I know as researchers, we're always trying to move towards that storytelling, away from the 200-page reports with lots of numbers and charts and graphs, and into that more storytelling, interactive features, those kinds of things. But what kind of evidence do you all need to help support this movement, and what can we provide? That's a tough one.
Oh, I got a long list.
I figured you would.
I mean, unfortunately and sadly, one of the reasons why Charlottesville got a boost in this dramatic change was the atrocities that happened in 2017. We were visited by Nazis and white supremacists, and we kind of said enough is enough. And housing was the issue that people coalesced around, and naturally, the ability to build more housing was central to that conversation. And then we started looking at not just supply, but demand and patterns of racial and economic segregation. And so if it weren't for, there was, we had a journalist who basically quit his day job and devoted his full time to going to the courthouse and painstakingly pulling every single deed. Not every community has Jordy Yeager like that, but some support in peeling back the onion and showing the historical nexus between policies that nobody supports other than the worst of the white supremacists, and the way things are, and making the point in every town, in every city, in every rural area that is not naturally occurring, that zoning for the most part is a product of intentional strategies over a number of decades to segregate us and to deny opportunity to some people. And that's thing one. Thing two, and I want to give a shout out to our friends from Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Portland, some of the real trailblazers who were the first to take on R1 zoning. I'd really love to see studies done between simply supply side upzonings and upzonings that also work on the demand side. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, love to see some examples. Now that there are different models, I'd like to see examples of what happens to the pressure on housing prices when you simply increase supply through upzoning, and what happens when you put some sort of requirements on it, like affordable housing overlays and density bonuses and whatnot, and see what works, what doesn't work, how much you have to turn the lever to both get more production and more supply, but also to make sure that that production and supply isn't just going to people who otherwise would have housing.
I guess if I could add to that, there's kind of three that come to mind for me. As I mentioned, when we started, we were intentional about the housing for all component. And I think every time we talked about zoning for housing, we said it's because we want a more equitable community. Even now, when we've talked about a dashboard, the dashboard is things like how many permits are pulled and what affordability levels. And that's really important, but to me, that doesn't tell me if we're getting any closer to being a more equitable community. And so I think whatever, metrics we decide on, I think sometimes that's the space where researchers could really help us be intentional and realize we can't measure everything, and there's a lot of things we probably don't already even collect that we should be collecting. And so helping us prioritize and helping us also understand that once the researchers leave, there's a cost associated to maintaining that data, looking at it, and continuing to go back to it. And I don't think cities always have that information. I'd say the second is any sort of research on, again, if we're being comprehensive in how these policies work together. I think you mentioned this earlier. In the same places where we didn't build housing, there's the same places where we didn't invest in infrastructure and other things. And so kind of understanding how some of those policies also interact with zoning reforms and what needs to be in place to make this successful is important. And then the third, I always find it really valuable when I see studies look at the differences in strong versus weak markets. Alexandria is a really expensive place. There are a lot of great housing policies, but every single one I know will not work in my community or might need to be tweaked or changed in order to. And so that data that really gets into, if you are in a strong market, these are the types of policies that could be most impactful, I think is really helpful.
Great.
I don't have a lot to add. I think you guys have covered a lot. But I think one of the things I've noticed in the last year, I've been president of APA going to both urban and rural areas, is this is often seen as an urban issue, and it's not. And I think the more information the more research that's out there for our smaller and more rural communities is helpful to them as they start looking at how do they think about these types of changes to scale in their communities, because it's one thing we know, if it's happening here, it's coming somewhere else. And so looking at forecasting and really helping to project what that could potentially look at. And we know there are cities who are doing great things now, but they're doing it now, but they should have done it 20 years ago. So helping project that out, because I'm not going to name any names because I might lose my job. But, there are some cities that are doing great things now, but the ship has kind of sailed, and I don't know how you get it back. So how do we help the cities that still it's obtainable that these things could make a difference for the immediate future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great call. Great. Well, we have a whole list. We can go write some proposals. So we're going to get to some audience Q&A in a moment. But before we get there, if you guys could just each go down the line one by one and tell us, what are your real key takeaways and actionable recommendations, those in attendance who are interested in promoting land use reforms in their communities?
Okay, well, I'm president of APA, so you can't expect that I wouldn't do a plug. So over the last year, the American Planning Association and National League of Cities has been working on our Housing Supply Accelerator, which has been working with elected leaders, financiers, construction, everybody who has anything to do with housing. And so we'll be looking at coming out with our final report and hopefully some type of, I don't want to use the word toolkit, but some type of recommendation that could be helped. So looking for that and look forward to all of you getting engaged in that work. I would also say another resource that APA has is the Planning for Equity Guide that we put out. That is something you can use in your communities to really help you know the types of things you should be looking for, and it's actually written for anybody. You don't need a PhD to read, so it's very user-friendly, which is not something that always happens with a lot of these documents. So I just think that, the thing, if you have to walk away, that for I would say is just be engaged, really participate in the process, not just on the policy side, but within those land use meetings and comprehensive plan meetings that are happening in your communities, and engage your planners and your elected leaders with the stories of success of the great work that those of you that have in Habitat or whatever communities are doing, because it really does make the difference. Because when you see the face of who's being housed because of a proposal, it really makes it resonate. Because I think housing is such a big issue right now because it is so visible, the number of unhoused people in our communities, that you kind of have to start thinking about it. And it shouldn't take us getting at DEFCON 1 for us to start making some real action in our communities and policy.
I think the key item that I've really taken from this conversation has been about the role of community advocates in trying to push for change. One thing that we didn't have the chance to speak about today is the reality that for decades, the planning conversation in the United States has been dominated by homeowning, largely white, older individuals. And those people have largely determined the future of our communities. And this shows up not only in terms of who shows up to planning meetings, but also it shows up in terms of who actually sits on those planning bodies. We did a study looking at the representation of communities in terms of who is sitting on planning boards, boards of zoning appeal, et cetera. And what we found is that women, renters, Hispanics were systematically underrepresented in those bodies. And what I'm hearing here are some great ideas about how to change that dynamic by bringing new types of people into the room, new types of conversation, and perhaps put a new spin on what we want for our future. So I'm really excited about learning more about that.
So I'll give you mine, but really quick, just aside, because it builds on something you just mentioned. When we were going through our public testimony for our Zoning for Housing initiative, and every speaker in the beginning came up and said, I've lived here for X amount of years. I've lived here for 40 years. I've lived here for this amount of years. And that was kind of the way it started. And probably like 50 or 60 people in, this one woman came to the mic, and I wrote it down, but she said, I should probably start with how many years I've lived here. She's like, but I'm not, because I'm new here. And I'm not, because it doesn't matter. She was like, I live here now, and I care about this city. And you noticed a shift in every single speaker after her. And I think it was so important because it really transformed the conversation from, this isn't about how long you've lived here. This is about the city we want to have. And that matters for folks who've lived here a long time or a short time. And so I just loved it because it was such a pivotal moment in our testimony. In terms of my advice, I guess I would say, one, I still do think it's so important to start with history and really making that history local. I think it's really hard for people when you name big policies like zoning, redlining, urban renewal. They're like, what is that and how did it matter to my community? So I think the more you can localize that history is important. I'd say two, as you're talking about expanding the table, just always asking who's missing. This is an issue that matters to everybody. I mean, it's our housing. And we may not all agree on what that housing should look like, but we all should agree that everyone should have safe, decent, and affordable housing. And so I think, whether that's talking to the person on your commute on the metro, to the neighbor who lives next to you, I think this is something where you can constantly be engaging with new voices and new people. And then third, in our case, it was difficult to talk about, but I think it was the best package we could put forth, and that was, it wasn't just one. As I mentioned, it was 8 policies. And I think each of those 8 plays a specific role in what we're trying to create. Every single one will not address affordability. Every single one will not address availability or accessibility. But together, I think they move us forward. And that, I think, was really important in having a package that looks at height, looks at parking, looks at climate impacts, and so forth.
Thank you. No, much of that. The biggest thing I would implore you all to do is to do what we do best at Habitat, and that's appeal to people's better angels. When you really look at the history of zoning and you read the literature, it can infuriate you, and it can get you frustrated, and it can create battle lines that are unproductive. And so listen to NIMBYs. See what it is that they care about in their neighborhood. You might find something that's actually really useful, where you can find something that you can find a definition of a city that we want, not necessarily the city that we used to have. And I'll give you one quick example. Like everything in Charlottesville, things were blowing up, and you had camps kind of starting to align. And I got this really inflammatory email from somebody in my neighborhood association. So we're having a special meeting to talk about these changes that people are looking to do to our neighborhood. And I thought, oh, well, sure, because I'll go to that one. And so I went to that one, and I listened to my neighbors, people who I care about, who I like, who I share my future with, talk about, just all sorts of really talk from a position, a place of fear and fear of change. But I heard also some kernels of things that I thought we could build on, we could work with. And I heard this constant refrain: I'm not against change in my neighborhood as long as it advances equity goals in Charlottesville, as long as we get what we want and not just density for density's sake. It's like, oh, okay, well, we can work with that. And so that's when Habitat aligned with another local affordable housing provider, and we proposed this idea of first unit affordable across the board. So that we have listened to the neighborhoods and said, look, what we've heard, I heard my neighborhood, my NIMBY neighborhood, say we'd welcome change if it advances the goals of affordable housing and equity and makes our neighborhood more diverse. Well, yeah, let's go with that. And so don't just write people off, and I'm sure people don't, but use your platform. We have an amazing platform at Habitat. We are one of the few institutions left that's trusted by people from all points on the political spectrum. We have an ability to take the temperature down in a room and elevate things like justice and and togetherness and community. And so really build on that.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, that links to another point. There's so many other positive benefits of housing affordability that matter to everyone, right? And I think making those linkages, right? So like as a mom with young kids in the PTA meetings, when people are complaining about school class sizes, well, why do you think that is? Because teachers can't afford to live anywhere near here, right? And so making those linkages, if we can make our communities more inclusive and equitable, it really benefits us all. So that's something we also hope to do with research. All right, got some great questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one related to how the relationship between zoning reforms and the racial homeownership gap. So specifically, what is the intersection, or how can availability of affordable housing be balanced with the equity benefits of homeownership and building generational wealth when that traditionally relies on single-family homes and the reforms are promoting housing that seems to be focused on rental? If the answer is to promote ownership in units and multiplexes, what needs to happen to make that a more common or accessible option? I'll leave that open to anyone who'd like to hop in.
Can you start?
It's a good one.
That is an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think whoever this questioner is very intelligent and has thought through this issue for a long time. It's apparent. It is true that many of the zoning reforms are about creating multifamily units, many of which are rental units, and so there is clearly an inherent contradiction between promoting more of the housing stock in the form of rental units versus the goal of increasing, homeowners' equity through homeownership. These are not necessarily the same concept, and I don't think we should necessarily be attempting to address, frankly, both birds with the same stone. I think we probably need other approaches than just zoning to address the huge homeownership gap that exists in many parts of the country. I think we need assistance for home buying. We need education programs. We need debt relief for folks out there. And those things go way beyond zoning from my perspective.
I feel strongly about this because this was obviously, I'm at Habitat because I believe in affordable home ownership and equity through home ownership. It created the American middle class. I'm not an advocate for home ownership because I'm at Habitat. And so I want to be really clear about that. And so in the zoning conversation, you'll see camps, between those who believe in the equity and subsidy, and subsidy, make no mistake, zoning, upzoning is subsidy. But they want to see that invested only in the unit versus those who want more people-based assistance. And we have to build a holistic housing ladder of opportunity. There has to be all sorts of housing for all kinds of people in all sorts of places. The problem is in Charlottesville and elsewhere that permanent affordability is sort of seen as the magic bullet right now. People want to know, how are we going to maintain a housing stock 60 years from now? It's a good question to have. And so on the homeownership side, people who are responsible for the numbers, right, saying we created this number of affordable units, we still have this number of affordable units. People who are responsible for tracking it. It's much easier to track rentals than it is for tracking homeownership. They're all going to land on the side of permanent affordability and rentals. It's easier, and that's what so much of our housing policy nationally subsidizes. But I've always make this point that if you invest one time in a family and they're no longer poor, you don't need to invest in, you don't necessarily need to continue to make that investment. So if we've taken a unit, made that permanent affordability, if we've taken a family and taken them off the rolls of subsistence living, then isn't that equally as good? And it's an uphill battle because that's not the way the national housing policy world is aligned right now, but we have to keep fighting that fight.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
I would just say, as a renter, I think it's a really good question. I do think that they don't have to be, multifamily housing doesn't have to be renter. And, we have to look at financing models that make multifamily ownership models work better. Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that because there's a lot of policies along with condos that make those not inviting, hard to finance, all of that. Right. And it's just a reminder that this isn't a one-size-fits-all, and it's a full cycle of stuff we have to look at to really increase affordability.
Absolutely. Another good question from the audience. What kinds of federal actions could help scale equitable land use reforms?
Oh, boy. I think the Housing Supply and Affordability Act is still going on. Yes, in my backyard there. I think at the end of the day, I'm a developer, and, it all comes down to money and how we can pay for it. And, we've got to have, subsidy is always a dirty word, but it's a necessary word when you're looking at creating affordable housing. So we have to continue to advocate for continued funding. Low-income housing tax credits is the majority of how I fund most of my work, but that's not enough. And we've got to look at other sources that are out there to increase it. We can come up with these great plans to create more units, but if we can't pay for it and people can't rent it or buy it, it's not going to happen. So, continue, and we have to really continue to work on bipartisan solutions, because we know the last few years have proven nothing's going to happen without that. So we have to continue to build those coalitions. But, that's my quick answer for that one.
I would echo everything on funding. I'd also say too that the federal, at least in our case, the federal is only one piece of it. We are in a state where I mentioned before, it's a Dillon rule state, and it is a mother may I ask permission before we can do anything. Most of these things that we're talking about today, especially zoning, these are local decisions and local issues. And so for us, I think we're in a place, even if we got a lot of opportunity from the federal government, if we don't have the authority to take advantage of some of those things or to put different policies in place because our state won't let us or our state's calling that back, that's a huge problem. And then we're at a disadvantage for even applying for those federal grants and federal resources. So I don't know what states people are coming from, but I imagine we're not the only one who has this challenge. It's an exciting time for us with some new leadership at our House and Senate, but I do think that's always really important, whether that's preemption laws or things like that. You're looking at also thinking about what role is the state playing, and are there things they're doing that's impeding even the best federal environment or the most aggressive or exciting local leaders from being able to actually move some of these changes.
Senator Warren proposed block grants for municipalities that undertake comprehensive zoning reform, and I couldn't be more supportive of that. I think looking at strong versus weak markets and having different solutions makes sense. So Habitat has supported the National Homeowner Investment Act to help recapitalize neighborhoods in more poorly performing communities, in particular to take some of the existing housing stock and turn it into affordable housing. Is another thing. And then finally, this is not necessarily funding or even policy, but it's enforcement of things that we have on the book. So if you read the if you look at the law about affirmatively furthering fair housing, we do a really bad job by having zoning codes that segregate us by rich and poor and white and black, Latino and non-Latino. And we should really, I don't know if penalize is the word, but, well, okay, let's say it, penalize municipalities that haven't actually actively looked at patterns of residential segregation in their community and done something affirmative to correct it. And zoning is one of the most critical tools in doing that.
I would add two elements. One is just building on what you said about the fundamental need for more subsidies. To me, it's not a dirty word. To me, it's the key way that we achieve greater equity in our society. We just have to be okay with the fact that money is distributed unfairly in America today. So we need to find ways to correct that. So one of the key ways to do that is to provide more funding for Section 8 housing choice vouchers, provide more funding for HUD's home program. These are essential to help supplement the low-income housing tax credit, which frankly is not affordable for a huge share of the low and extremely low-income population throughout the country. We need to fill that gap, or we're going to continue having a major issue. And frankly, we have to do that in relationship with the states. State governments can play a role here. State governments often have quite the surplus in recent years that they could be contributing to state housing trust funds. The second thing I would really love to see is additional federal support for making that transportation housing connection that I talked about earlier. I think there are a lot of investments that have been made throughout the country thanks to the infrastructure law that was passed in 2021. A lot of those have gone to new bus rapid transit or light rail lines throughout the country. But one concern I have is that a community might get this new investment and then see no development in the surrounding areas. I think the federal government could associate new grants for land acquisition, supporting land banks, perhaps local social housing in areas directly around stations, so that there's a direct association between the investment in the new infrastructure and housing that's affordable for low-income folks.
Awesome. Wait, we have 10 minutes? We have time for one more question? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to end on a tough question, but I think it's a question that that is really hard. A lot of people who are questioning this, and so I'll let whoever wants to answer this take it. Okay, so I don't see how, this is not my question, I don't see how simply changing zoning to permit greater density will necessarily lead to producing more affordable housing, since the cost of producing any new housing is so high right now that only luxury housing gets built unless it's heavily subsidized. Could one of you walk us through that link of how we get there, or one or more?
I can try to take a first stab at this.
Sure.
The first is, when we think about supporting new subsidized affordable housing in the United States, as you said, it's mostly about LIHTC, the low-income housing tax credit. And as I said earlier in the discussion, those units often have to be concentrated in just a very small percentage of the land in communities because of restrictions on allowances for multifamily zoning. One thing we can do by deregulating zoning, by allowing more multifamily, is essentially make it easier to purchase land if you are an investor in a low-income housing tax credit project or you're a nonprofit developer. You have more options to choose from land if more land allows that type of building to be built in the first place. The second thing that's worth pointing out here is that the reality is that the housing market is one where folks move around, okay? People move from one unit to another unit, as everyone in this room knows. I'm sure everyone has moved in their lives. This process, the way it occurs when you get new housing built in communities, even if it's market rate, is something called filtering. And filtering essentially means that higher and upper middle class people can move into new developments, which essentially frees up older units. Now, this is a process that is, I just want to be clear, it's not ideal because essentially it means that lower income people live in the older units, but it is the way that our housing market works. And so when you put more new market rate units on the market, you are inevitably freeing up more of those lower cost units for people who can afford them without subsidies. So that's an essential mechanism that we can build up through zoning changes.
I was just gonna say I'm an example of that, and I use myself in that same way. Like, I'm a renter, and on paper I could afford to buy. I live in a naturally affordable unit because the market rate units in my community are not on paper to me affordable. So I can afford to live in an older, nicer unit because I'm not going to pay $2,500 for another. So I'm holding a seat. And so I do think that is a really big example, and which is why for the first time in my career, I find myself really being focused on market rate housing as much as I am on affordable, because I realize I'm a clog in the system, which is, it's a hard thing to look in the mirror and realize you're a clog in the system, something you work to do. So I do think that's a really important part of it. And I think moving forward, I think a lot of us who are advocates on the affordable side have to be cognizant of that and really focused on that as well. And it's not a space most of us have ever really looked at.
Yeah, this is a place where we have to be honest with folks in low-income communities as well, because you hear a lot of anti-density, sort of knee-jerk anti-density in low-income communities, and I understand why, because density in most cities has been built on the backs of low-income folks who have struggled to stay in their neighborhoods and in their homes. But it's a bit of a straw man, and it's a straw man for a couple of reasons. One is that we all know that density is necessary to build more supply, but it's insufficient for really dealing on the demand side. That you are going to build more, and primarily if you just build more without any other subsidies or other regulations or other ways to kind of push and advantage affordable housing, the vast majority of that, even though it might soften prices, the vast majority of that's going to go to people who already could afford housing. So other things have to happen. But here's something that's true in a lot of towns, is there's a barbell effect in terms of housing supply. That there's a gigantic need at the lower incomes, right? There's almost no, I mean, we saw the stats earlier in the preamble to this talk, to this panel, that there's almost no housing that's affordable to people who earn minimum wage or less across the country and in every municipality. But there's also actually a fairly small supply of $1 million and above housing. And so what happens, Yona, you alluded to this, folks from the upper incomes push into the middle income sector, creating supply constraints at every single level. And so you have to address all of that. People are surprised when they hear me advocating for luxury condos in downtown, in Charlottesville and other places, but you need to build it, or people who can afford to pay more are going to pay less and squeeze out other folks.
I think building upon it, back to the advice I gave earlier about just the need to be comprehensive and thinking about a range of different policies. So we had this very debate over and over throughout our zoning for housing. And we have one policy, our RMF zones, our residential multifamily, where if you take advantage of the density bonuses afforded through that tool, a third of the new density has to be affordable to people at 40% AMI and below. So in our region, that's like $40,000 and below. A very intentional tool for that section of the market. When you look at some of the things we were looking at in our single family home zones, again, I'm in Alexandria. In some of our single family home zones, we've got homes 10 million and above. So when you're looking at this, no, you're not going to get something that is $40,000. But we find that a lot of the people who came to our hearings, they would say, I'm a young family. And when I had my second child, we wanted another bedroom. But there's no other place that we could go get that other bedroom, because even though we can afford maybe the $650,000, the $750,000 duplex, 10 other people go bid on that, and it no longer costs that anymore. And so I think it was an easier, I don't say an easier sell, but I think it was an important part of the conversation to be able to speak that if we are truly talking about housing for all, then what does all look like in this community? What are the different parts of the market that are having challenges? And then what are the tools that will address each of that? Because one alone will not. And so, yeah, I just lift that up because that was something that came out a lot throughout our debates.
And I do think we're uniquely in a situation with a lot of office conversion to residential opportunities. And I don't know how it is in most of your cities, but I know in every city I've lived in, one of the largest property owners in the city is the city. And so working with cities on their disposition for housing is a big thing. And that is something we should be advocating for, because if they're sitting on it, like, you're sitting on it. And, it could be doing something else. So, I think that is something we have to be looking at and holding our jurisdictions accountable to the land that they're sitting on, holding for, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, this was amazing. Those were great answers. This whole panel has been amazing. Great to learn from you all. Thank you all so much for coming, both in the audience and online. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder that this is going to be recorded and available on our website, so please feel free to share it with others. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.